The shaman's fingers close around leaves that could stop your heart within minutes. Yet in those same practiced hands, measured in amounts invisible to untrained eyes, those leaves become medicine that has saved thousands of lives. This is the razor's edge, where the Amazon's deadliest plants transform into humanity's most powerful healers, where a single miscalculation means death, and perfect knowledge means survival. For millennia, indigenous tribes have walked this knife's edge, learning through careful observation, sacred ritual, and undoubtedly tragic error, which plants guard healing power behind veils of lethal toxin. Western medicine dismissed these practices as primitive superstition until researchers began analyzing what shamans had known for generations, that nature's most dangerous chemical weapons often contain the keys to treating conditions modern pharmaceuticals struggle to address. The Amazon doesn't distinguish between poison and cure. It simply creates compounds of staggering complexity, and humanity must learn to navigate their dual nature. The rainforest cultivates danger as a survival strategy. Nearly every creature, every plant, carries some defense mechanism against being consumed. Bright colors advertise poison. Bitter tastes signal toxicity, yet indigenous peoples learned that the very intensity of these chemical defenses meant concentrated power, power that properly harnessed could heal what nothing else could touch. What follows are 5 plants that embody this paradox most dramatically, each capable of killing swiftly, each holding within their toxic architecture the potential to save lives. The first plant grows as an unassuming woody vine climbing toward the canopy, its appearance giving no hint of the paralytic death contained in its tissues. Indigenous tribes across the western Amazon know it by many names, but to the outside world it became known as curare, the arrow poison that turns prey into statues. When Chondrodendron tomentosum's bark and stems are scraped, boiled and reduced to a sticky black paste, the resulting concentrate contains alkaloids that block the transmission between nerves and muscles. An animal struck by a curare-tipped arrow doesn't bleed out or succumb to organ failure. It simply stops breathing as its diaphragm freezes, conscious but completely paralyzed. For the tribes of the Orinoco Basin and the western Amazon, curare meant the difference between eating and starving. Monkeys high in the canopy, birds in flight, tapirs crashing through undergrowth, all could be brought down cleanly without contaminating their meat, since curare's toxins don't spread through tissue and break down rapidly after death. The preparation required profound knowledge passed through generations. Different tribes used different plant combinations, some adding other toxic vines from the strychnos family, some incorporating frog secretions. Each recipe a closely guarded tradition refined over centuries of lethal trial and error. European explorers first encountered curare in the 16th century when indigenous warriors used it to deadly effect against Spanish conquistadors. Francisco de Orellana's expedition down the Amazon in 1541 documented warriors whose arrows produced paralysis and death without visible wounds serious enough to kill. The substance terrified Europeans, an invisible poison that left victims conscious but helpless as their lungs stopped functioning seemed like dark sorcery. For 3 centuries, curare remained in the realm of exotic dangers, a curiosity brought back in sealed containers by adventurers who understood its lethal power but saw no medicinal value in paralysis. The transformation began in the 19th century when scientists started isolating and analyzing curare's active compounds. French physiologist Claude Bernard demonstrated in 1856 that curare specifically blocked neuromuscular junctions without affecting the heart or other vital functions, provided artificial respiration maintained breathing. This revelation sparked a fundamental question. If curare could selectively paralyze muscles while keeping consciousness intact, could it be used in surgery? The answer revolutionized medicine. orchestrated pacing strategy across 5 Amazonian plants with structured word allocation. I'm doing well so far. I need to continue with the curare story, then move through the other 4 plants. Let me make sure I'm hitting about 4,800 words total. I'm at about 700 words so far, so I need to pace this carefully. Roughly 900 to 1,000 words per plant to reach the target. I need to continue curare's medical transformation, introduce ayahuasca, plant 2, cover Pilocarpus jabarandi, plant 3, discuss strychnos species or datura, plant 4, present the 5th plant, maybe tobacco or another, modern implications and ongoing research, closing with wonder and CTA. Let me continue with curare's modern medical use, then transition to the next plant. By the 1940s, purified forms of curare entered operating rooms as the first muscle relaxants in anesthesia. Tubercurarine, the primary alkaloid extracted from chondrodendron, allowed surgeons to achieve complete muscle relaxation during procedures while using far less general anesthetic, reducing risk and improving outcomes. Abdominal surgeries that once required dangerously deep anesthesia could now be performed with patients in lighter states. The curare doing the work of relaxing muscles that would otherwise tense and resist. Today's synthetic derivatives of curare compounds remain essential in surgeries worldwide, especially in procedures requiring mechanical ventilation. A poison that indigenous hunters wielded with blowguns now saves lives in sterile operating theaters on every continent. The same molecular mechanism that drops monkeys from trees allows surgeons to safely open human chests. Yet the Amazon holds no patent on curare knowledge. The Matses people of the Javari Valley maintain that curare must be prepared during specific moon phases, that certain prayers must accompany the boiling process, that the maker must abstain from certain foods during preparation. Western scientists dismiss these requirements as superstition, yet they acknowledge that curare potency varies dramatically based on preparation methods they still don't fully understand. Some tribes insist the plants must be harvested by specific individuals, that intent affects the poison's power, that the forest itself decides who may wield such knowledge. Whether metaphor for unidentified variables or genuine mysteries, the gap between indigenous understanding and scientific replication remains. The second plant on this razor's edge grows as a thick woody vine, distinctive for its twisted, fluted stems that snake through the understory. Banisteriopsis capi looks unremarkable to untrained eyes, but to the indigenous peoples of the Amazon basin, it is the teacher vine, the spirit ladder, the doorway between worlds. The plant contains powerful MAO inhibitors that, when combined with DMT-containing plants like Psychotria viridis, create the brew known as ayahuasca, a concoction that has killed the careless and healed the desperate in equal measure throughout Amazonian history. The toxicity begins with violent purging. Indigenous shamans call this cleansing, and it often is, but the line between therapeutic purging and dangerous toxicity is measured in subtle variations of dosage and individual physiology. Too much, or the wrong combination, and ayahuasca produces dangerously elevated heart rate, severe dehydration from relentless vomiting, dangerous interactions with modern pharmaceuticals, and in rare cases, death. Certain antidepressants, combined with ayahuasca's MAO inhibitors, create potentially fatal serotonin syndrome. Unregulated ayahuasca tourism in recent decades has produced numerous fatalities when inexperienced facilitators misjudged dosages or failed to screen participants for contraindicated medications. Yet for millennia, properly administered ayahuasca has served as powerful medicine for conditions that resist other treatments. The Shipibo people of eastern Peru have used the brew for centuries to treat spiritual illnesses, what Western medicine might categorize as depression, PTSD, addiction, existential despair. The experience ayahuasca produces defies simple description, visions that feel more real than reality, confrontation with one's deepest traumas and fears, dissolution of ego boundaries, profound emotional releases, and often lasting psychological transformation. Shamans describe ayahuasca as showing people their illnesses so clearly that healing becomes possible. The plant doesn't cure, it reveals what requires curing. Modern psychiatric research has begun investigating what indigenous healers have practiced for generations. Studies at institutions like Johns Hopkins and Imperial College London demonstrate that ayahuasca produces measurable changes in brain activity, particularly in regions associated with self-reflection and emotional processing. Patients with treatment-resistant depression who undergo carefully supervised ayahuasca sessions show significant symptom reduction that persists for months. Veterans with PTSD report breakthrough healing after single ceremonies that exceeded years of conventional therapy. The brew seems to temporarily disrupt rigid thought patterns and defensive psychological structures, allowing people to process trauma they've spent lifetimes avoiding. The mechanism fascinates researchers precisely because it contradicts pharmaceutical assumptions. Where conventional antidepressants must be taken daily to maintain effect, ayahuasca produces lasting changes from brief, intense experiences. The DMT component binds to serotonin receptors, but does so in ways that trigger entirely different neural cascades than SSRIs. Meanwhile, the Harmala alkaloids from Banisteriopsis caapi affect multiple neurotransmitter systems simultaneously, a complexity that no manufactured drug replicates. Indigenous shamans insist that ayahuasca is not a drug, but a teacher, that the plant possesses intelligence and intention, that proper healing requires respectful relationship with the plant's spirit. Western science lacks categories for such claims, yet researchers admit they cannot explain why identical chemical compounds administered in sterile clinical settings produce markedly different results than the same substances taken in traditional ceremonial contexts with shamanic guidance. The preparation itself reveals layers of knowledge that science is only beginning to comprehend. The Banisteriopsis caapi vine and Psychotria viridis leaves must be boiled together for hours, sometimes days, the resulting tea reduced to concentrated form. But scores of Amazonian plants contain DMT. Why specifically these two? The shamanic explanation involves plant spirits communicating which combinations work, knowledge received in ayahuasca, visions themselves, a recursive loop where the medicine teaches its own preparation. The scientific explanation notes that Psychotria viridis contains unusually high DMT concentrations, and that Banisteriopsis caapi's MAO inhibitors are among the most potent of any plant. But this still doesn't explain how indigenous peoples, with no understanding of biochemistry, identified this precise pairing among millions of possible plant combinations. Some researchers estimate that discovering this combination through pure trial and error would require hundreds of thousands of experiments. The ayahuasca enigma challenges Western assumptions about how knowledge is acquired. Either indigenous peoples conducted an implausibly vast empirical project over countless generations, or they accessed information through means that scientific materialism cannot accommodate. The plants themselves remain indifferent to the debate, growing in the understory, containing within their tissues the same compounds that have killed the reckless and transformed the prepared for millennia. The third plant inhabits a different ecological niche altogether, preferring the understory's perpetual shade, where its large oval leaves capture every photon of filtered light. Helocarpus jabarandi, known commonly as jabarandi, presents glossy leaves that indigenous peoples learn to harvest with careful respect. Too much of this plant's essence, and the body turns on itself with excessive salivation, sweating, and potentially fatal fluid loss. The active compound, pilocarpine, forces the body's parasympathetic nervous system into overdrive. In toxic doses, pilocarpine triggers what medical texts describe as cholinergic crisis, uncontrolled secretions from every gland, nausea, vision distortion, difficulty breathing as bronchial passages constrict and flood with mucus, potentially cardiovascular collapse. Indigenous Tupi peoples use Jabarandi preparations to induce sweating and cleansing, carefully controlling dosage through preparation methods refined over generations. They understood that the same properties making Jabarandi dangerous, its ability to stimulate secretory glands, could be harnessed for healing when applied with precision. European colonizers first documented Jabarandi in the late 17th century when Jesuit missionaries in Brazil observed indigenous use for treating various conditions. But serious medical interest didn't emerge until 1873, when Brazilian physician Simfronio Coutinho sent Jabarandi samples to Europe with detailed descriptions of indigenous applications. Within 2 years, European and American physicians were experimenting with pilocarpine for conditions ranging from psoriasis to pneumonia. Most applications proved ineffective or too dangerous, as the narrow therapeutic window between useful dose and toxic dose produced inconsistent results. The breakthrough came with ophthalmology. Glaucoma, a condition where elevated pressure inside the eye gradually destroys the optic nerve, leads to irreversible blindness without treatment. Pilocarpine's ability to stimulate muscular contractions extends to the eye's ciliary muscle, which when activated opens drainage channels, allowing excess fluid to escape and pressure to normalize. Since the 1870s, pilocarpine eye drops have prevented blindness in millions of glaucoma patients worldwide, a perfectly targeted application where local administration avoids systemic toxicity. Yet Jabarandi nearly vanished before modern medicine fully recognized its value. Over-harvesting in the late 19th and early 20th centuries depleted wild populations across northeastern Brazil. Commercial collectors stripped plants faster than they could regenerate, driven by pharmaceutical demand that saw Jabarandi as merely a chemical resource rather than a living ecosystem component. By the 1990s, Jabarandi had become endangered in many regions where it once thrived. Conservation efforts now involve both habitat protection and cultivation programs, often led by the same indigenous communities whose traditional sustainable harvesting practices contrasted sharply with commercial exploitation. The irony resonates through Amazon conservation debates. Indigenous peoples who used Jabarandi for centuries maintained stable populations through rotational harvesting, spiritual restrictions on overharvesting, and complex ecological knowledge that treated the plant as part of a living community requiring respect. Western pharmaceutical companies, arriving with purely extractive mindsets, nearly destroyed what they sought to exploit. Today's synthesis of pilocarpine in laboratories removes pressure from wild populations, but the lesson about valuing indigenous knowledge systems, not just indigenous knowledge of individual plants, remains incompletely learned. Current research investigates Jabarandi for conditions beyond glaucoma. Studies explore pilocarpine's potential for treating dry mouth in cancer patients, Sjögren's syndrome, and other conditions involving inadequate gland secretion, situations where its dangerous stimulating properties become precisely calibrated therapeutic effects. Each new application validates what indigenous Tupi healers understood intuitively, that plants making the body produce excess fluids could treat conditions of deficient fluid production. The challenge remains finding the balance between stimulating necessary secretion and triggering dangerous overproduction, the same balance traditional healers maintain through preparation methods Western medicine is still working to fully replicate. The fourth plant in this deadly yet healing collection belongs to a genus infamous for producing some of nature's most potent toxins, Species of strychnos scattered across the Amazon contain strychnine and related alkaloids, compounds that cause violent convulsive death by overstimulating the nervous system. Yet these same plants, in carefully prepared forms, have served indigenous medicine for purposes ranging from digestive complaints to parasite elimination. Strychnos, toxifera, and related species produce seeds and bark that, when improperly prepared, trigger symptoms resembling those described in Victorian murder mysteries. Muscle spasms escalating to full-body convulsions, the spine arching violently backward in what medical texts call opistotonos, consciousness remaining intact as the body destroys itself through muscular contractions powerful enough to fracture bones. Death comes from exhaustion or asphyxiation when respiratory muscles seize. Indigenous peoples knew strychnos species as powerful tools requiring absolute expertise. A single seed improperly prepared could kill, while proper preparation produced effective medicines. The key lies in the preparation method's complexity. Traditional protocols involve repeated washing, extended boiling, specific neutralizing agents, and sometimes aging or fermentation, processes that reduce alkaloid concentration to subtoxic levels while preserving other compounds with therapeutic effects. Different tribes develop different protocols for different strychnos species and different intended uses. The Ticuna people of the western Amazon used minute amounts of specially prepared strychnos extract as a digestive stimulant, while other groups incorporated it into hunting poison formulas alongside curare, each toxic plant amplifying the other's effects. European pharmacology's relationship with strychnos has been troubled and ultimately limited. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, Western doctors prescribed strychnine in small doses as a stimulant and tonic, believing it strengthened the nervous system, a dangerous practice that produced numerous accidental poisonings. The therapeutic window proved too narrow for safe use in conventional medicine, and by mid-century, medical strychnine applications had been abandoned. Yet indigenous use continued, guided by preparation wisdom that Western pharmacology never fully decoded. Recent ethnobotanical research suggests that indigenous strychnos preparations may contain compounds beyond strychnine that contribute to therapeutic effects. When researchers analyze traditionally prepared medicines, they find alkaloid profiles dramatically different from raw plant material. Some toxic compounds reduced or modified, other compounds enhanced or preserved. The processing methods function as sophisticated chemistry that alters not just concentration, but molecular structure. This challenges pharmaceutical assumptions that traditional preparations are simply crude forms of pure drug extraction. Instead, they represent complex formulations where processing itself creates novel therapeutic compounds. The ethical dimensions of researching strychnos and similar toxic medicinal plants have evolved considerably. Early researchers simply extracted knowledge and compounds without compensation or consent, producing patents on molecules that indigenous peoples had been using for millennia. Modern protocols, at least in theory, require benefit-sharing agreements, respect for traditional knowledge, and indigenous community involvement in research design and interpretation. Yet tensions remain around who owns knowledge developed over countless generations, whether isolated compounds truly replicate traditional preparations' effects, and how to value knowledge that may have cost lives to acquire through trial and error. Strychnos species remain primarily academic curiosities in Western medicine, too dangerous for routine use, their therapeutic applications too narrow or better served by safer alternatives. But in communities throughout the Amazon, healers still prepare strychnos formulations with the same careful precision their ancestors employed. still treat conditions for which Western medicine offers limited options, still maintain knowledge systems where the difference between poison and cure lies not in the substance, but in the wisdom of its application. The fifth plant towers above the others in this collection, quite literally, Angel's Trumpet, the Brugmansia species that drapes enormous pendulous flowers from branches throughout the Amazon basin. These spectacular blooms emit intoxicating fragrance at night, attracting the hawk moths that pollinate them, but every part of the plant, flower, leaf, seed, root, contains tropane alkaloids potent enough to produce deadly delirium. The alkaloids scopolamine, hyoscyamine, and atropine transform Angel's Trumpet from garden ornamental into one of the Amazon's most feared plants. Ingestion produces a unique psychological state called tropane psychosis, realistic hallucinations indistinguishable from reality, complete memory loss of the experience, suggestibility so extreme that victims under its influence will comply with any instruction, and physical effects including dangerously elevated heart rate, potentially fatal hypothermia, and respiratory depression. Unlike ayahuasca or other psychoactive plants, where users typically maintain some awareness of altered consciousness, Angel's Trumpet erases the boundary between reality and hallucination entirely. Criminal exploitation of Angel's Trumpet's properties has given it sinister reputation in parts of South America. Powdered seeds or extracted compounds blown in victims' faces or mixed into drinks produce compliant zombies who empty their bank accounts, hand over valuables, or facilitate home robberies while fully conscious but completely under the perpetrator's control, waking hours later with no memory of events. Indigenous peoples have always known Angel's Trumpet demands extreme respect. Its use in traditional contexts involves rigorous protocols, experienced supervision, and clear spiritual intention. Yet within these same dangerous properties lie healing applications. Scopolamine in medically controlled microdoses prevents motion sickness and post-operative nausea. The same property that produces amnesia and confusion in toxic doses provides targeted antiemetic effects at tiny concentrations. Transdermal patches containing scopolamine help seasick travelers and chemotherapy patients without producing delirium. The tropane alkaloids' anticholinergic effects, which in toxic doses disrupt the entire parasympathetic nervous system, at proper dosages treat specific conditions involving excessive parasympathetic activity. Indigenous shamanic use of Angel's Trumpet exemplifies the concept of plant teachers. Among groups like the Shuar of Ecuador and Peru, controlled administration of Brugmansia preparations serves as initiation ritual, spiritual cleansing, and encounter with the supernatural. The experience is rarely described as pleasant. Angel's Trumpet doesn't produce the visionary insights of ayahuasca, but rather confronts users with their deepest fears, forces resolution of spiritual conflicts, strips away ego defenses completely. Shamans maintain that Angel's Trumpet shows people truths they desperately need to see but cannot face unaided, and that the subsequent memory loss allows integration of these truths without the trauma of conscious recollection. Modern psychiatry eyes Angel's Trumpet with mixture of fascination and appropriate terror. The complete ego dissolution it produces resembles electroconvulsive therapy in intensity, but with added risk of unpredictable behavior during the amnestic period. Small-scale studies have investigated whether controlled scopolamine administration might reset treatment-resistant depression or PTSD, similarly to ketamine infusions, but the toxicity to therapeutic effect ratio makes it an unlikely candidate for conventional treatment. Unlike ayahuasca, which is being cautiously welcomed into therapeutic contexts, Angel's Trumpet remains too dangerous, too unpredictable, too far beyond the edge of controllability. The preparation protocols for Angel's Trumpet demonstrate indigenous knowledge at its most sophisticated. Different species of Brugmansia contain different alkaloid ratios. Brugmansia suaveolens versus Brugmansia insignis produce qualitatively different experiences despite similar chemical profiles. Flower color supposedly matters, as does time of harvest, moon phase, and the gatherer's spiritual state. Western pharmacology dismisses most of these factors, yet indigenous practitioners maintain that identical chemical analyses miss crucial variables affecting the plant's power and intention. The same plant that has killed curious experimenters and enabled crimes also saves lives in operating rooms worldwide. The atropine extracted from angel's trumpet and related plants reverses certain poisonings, treats cardiac emergencies, dilates pupils for eye examinations, applications that exploit the same mechanisms producing deadly tropane psychosis. Each legitimate medical use emerged from understanding developed through indigenous experimentation over centuries, knowledge that necessarily cost lives to acquire. These 5 plants, curare, ayahuasca, jabarandi, strychnos, and angel's trumpet, represent a tiny fraction of the Amazon's toxic medicinal pharmacopoeia. Researchers estimate that indigenous peoples have identified and characterized thousands of plant species with medicinal properties, many combining toxicity with healing potential in ways Western medicine is only beginning to appreciate. The traditional knowledge systems guiding their use integrate botanical knowledge, spiritual cosmology, ecological understanding, and empirical observation into frameworks that resist reduction to chemical formulas. The urgency of documenting this knowledge intensifies as both the Amazon and indigenous cultures face existential threats. Every year, thousands of acres of rainforest fall to logging, ranching, and agricultural expansion, taking with them plant species that may hold cures for conditions medicine hasn't yet learned to treat. Simultaneously, younger indigenous generations increasingly migrate to cities, leaving behind traditional lifestyles and the knowledge systems embedded in them. When elder knowledge holders pass without successors, millennia of accumulated understanding disappears. The pharmaceutical industry's relationship with Amazonian plants remains ethically complicated. Companies seek to extract and patent individual compounds, create synthetic versions of curare's tubercurarine, pilocarpine from jabarandi, purified alkaloids from every toxic medicinal plant. This reductionist approach treats plants as mere chemical factories and indigenous knowledge as free raw material for profit. Modern benefit-sharing agreements attempt to address historical exploitation, but debates continue about fair compensation, intellectual property rights over traditional knowledge, and whether isolated compounds truly replicate the effects of traditionally prepared whole-plant medicines. Some researchers argue that indigenous preparation methods create synergistic compound interactions that single-molecule drugs cannot match. The multiple alkaloids in ayahuasca working together, the modified compound profile of processed strychnos bark, the complementary constituents in angel's trumpet preparations, these complex mixtures may produce therapeutic effects that purified drugs miss. If true, this suggests that Western pharmaceutical paradigms focused on single-molecule drugs are fundamentally inadequate for capturing many of the Amazon's medicinal secrets. The forest doesn't separate plants into active ingredients and inactive materials. It creates intricate chemical ecosystems within each species. Yet indigenous knowledge holders themselves acknowledge that their understanding has always been incomplete. Traditional protocols emphasize approaching these powerful plants with humility, recognizing that humans can never fully comprehend what plants have taken millions of years to evolve. Shamans describe learning from the plants themselves through visions, dreams, direct transmission, knowledge acquisition that challenges Western epistemology's assumption that information flows only through observable, reproducible experiments. Whether literal or metaphorical, this perspective positions plants as conscious teachers rather than passive resources, fundamentally reframing humanity's relationship with botanical medicine. The future of these 5 deadly yet healing plants, and the thousands of others like them throughout the Amazon, depends on decisions being made now about conservation, indigenous rights, and medical research ethics. Protected reserves that recognize indigenous territorial sovereignty offer some security for both ecosystems and traditional knowledge systems. Collaborative research models that involve indigenous peoples as equal partners rather than mere informants represent progress, though implementation often falls short of ideals. Some indigenous communities have chosen to maintain certain knowledge as secret, refusing to share preparation methods or plant identities with outsiders, regardless of potential medical benefits. This decision reflects hard lessons learned from centuries of exploitation, but also spiritual beliefs that some knowledge should remain restricted, that not all healing wisdom belongs to all of humanity. Western science struggles with the concept of legitimate knowledge secrecy, accustomed to assumptions that all information should ultimately be public and universally accessible. The tension between preserving indigenous autonomy and potentially discovering life-saving medicines remains unresolved. Meanwhile, the plants themselves continue growing in the understory, climbing toward the canopy, blooming in the night, indifferent to human debates about their proper use. They produce their alkaloids as evolutionary defense mechanisms, not as medicine for an invasive bipedal species that arrived in their ecosystem mere tens of thousands of years ago. That these compounds happen to interact with human neurochemistry and physiology in beneficial ways is profound accident, or as indigenous cosmologies might frame it, intentional gift from plant spirits to the humans humble enough to approach with respect. The razor's edge these plants embody, the space where death transforms into healing, mirrors larger ecological truths about the Amazon. The rainforest is simultaneously Earth's greatest pharmacy and one of its most dangerous environments. Every cure comes entangled with risk. Every medicine demands respect. Every healing plant can kill. This paradox isn't a flaw, but a fundamental principle. Power sufficient to heal must inherently be powerful enough to harm. Understanding these plants requires acknowledging that indigenous peoples aren't simply primitive chemists who stumbled upon useful compounds through blind trial and error. They developed sophisticated intellectual systems integrating empirical observation, experimental testing, spiritual practice, ecological awareness, and social institutions for preserving and transmitting knowledge. These systems produced accurate, reliable, therapeutically effective interventions for thousands of years before Western medicine existed. That they frame their knowledge in spiritual rather than mechanistic terms doesn't diminish its validity. It represents different epistemology reaching similar practical outcomes. The promise these plants hold for future medicine extends beyond their specific compounds. If medicine can learn to approach indigenous knowledge systems with genuine respect rather than extractive opportunism, if pharmaceutical development can shift from pure exploitation to authentic partnership, if conservation efforts can center indigenous territorial rights rather than treating humans as problems to be managed, then perhaps the Amazon's secrets can benefit humanity without destroying the ecosystems and cultures that guard them. This requires fundamental restructuring of relationships, power dynamics, and assumptions. Challenges far more difficult than chemical analysis, but ultimately more important. The Amazon holds perhaps 1 million species, most unstudied and many undiscovered. Among them are certainly plants with medicinal properties surpassing anything currently known. Plants that could treat Alzheimer's, cancer, antibiotic-resistant infections, conditions medicine hasn't yet identified. But these treasures don't wait in patient availability for scientific discovery. They disappear with every acre of forest cleared, every indigenous knowledge system that collapses, every elder who dies without passing on learning that took a lifetime to acquire. The 5 plants explored here, curare paralyzing then healing, ayahuasca poisoning then teaching, jabarandi overwhelming then restoring, strychnos convulsing then treating, angel's trumpet maddening then transforming, represent the Amazon's fundamental offer to humanity. The forest offers power sufficient to save lives, but only to those who approach with sufficient humility, respect, and wisdom to wield that power appropriately. The plants make no distinction between healing and harming. They simply exist, containing within their tissues molecules of staggering complexity and potential. Whether those molecules cure or kill depends entirely on human knowledge, intention, and respect for the edge where opposites converge. This is the Amazon's eternal lesson that life and death, poison and medicine, danger and healing are not opposites but intimate partners. The forest teaches that attempting to extract healing without acknowledging danger, benefit without risk, medicine without respect for its power, inevitably leads to failure and tragedy. The plants that can save your life are the same ones that can end it, and they demand you understand both possibilities before approaching either. Perhaps this is why the Amazon has resisted full scientific inventory despite centuries of study. The forest protects its secrets not out of malice, but as natural consequence of requiring understanding too deep, respect too profound, humility too complete for those approaching with purely extractive intent. The knowledge is available. Indigenous peoples prove this by continuing to use these plants effectively, but only to those willing to learn the forest's language, accept its terms, and become students rather than conquerors. The 5 deadly plants that can save your life wait in the Amazon's green cathedral still, their alkaloids potent, their lessons unchanged by centuries. They will continue producing their compounds, offering their dual nature, teaching those humble enough to learn, killing those too arrogant to respect them. If you're drawn to mysteries where danger and healing intertwine, where ancient wisdom challenges modern assumptions, and where the line between poison and cure vanishes in the hands of those who truly understand, join us as we continue exploring what the rainforest reluctantly reveals. Subscribe to Lost Amazon Tales and venture deeper into the green unknown.